The rain drenched her hospital gown as her husband threw the divorce papers into the mud. "Sign it, Clara. Evelyn needs the marrow, and you're just a match." She signed it, died hours later on the cold operating table, and woke up 3 years in the past on her wedding anniversary. The scent of expensive lilies always made Clara gag, but for 3 years she had filled their penthouse with them, because Julian loved their pristine, clinical white. Now, standing in the center of the living room, she watched the crystal vase shatter against the hardwood floor. Water soaked into the Persian rug, carrying petals and sharp shards. Clara didn't blink. She looked down at her hands. They were smooth, unmarred by the countless IV tracks and the bruised, yellowing skin that had defined her final weeks in the sterile white room of St. Jude's Hospital. She was 26 again. Her heart beat with a steady, rhythmic thud, not the erratic, failing flutter of a woman bleeding out on an operating table, while her husband held another woman's hand in the next room. The front door clicked open. Julian walked in, his tailored charcoal suit pristine despite the autumn downpour outside. He was breathtakingly handsome in a cold, sharp way, his jawline like a blade and his dark eyes perpetually bored. He paused, his gaze dropping to the broken glass, then shifting to Clara. His expression instantly hardened into that familiar, exhausting mask of irritation. "What is this, Clara?" Julian's voice was a low baritone, clipping each word. "I told you I had a late meeting with the board. If this is another one of your childish tantrums because I missed dinner, I don't have the energy for it." In her past life, Clara would have scrambled to clean the glass, apologizing through tears, desperately explaining that she had cooked his favorite meal, that she just wanted one evening where he looked at her instead of his phone. She would have begged for a scrap of his warmth. Instead, Clara took a slow, deep breath. The air tasted clean. It didn't smell like antiseptic or her own decaying hope. She looked directly into Julian's eyes, her own gaze completely devoid of the frantic devotion that usually mirrored his presence. "The dinner is cold, Julian. Just like this marriage," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. Julian frowned, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before being replaced by a sneer. "Don't dramatize. I work 80 hours a week to provide this life for you. You sit in this penthouse, spending my money, and complain about loneliness? You knew who I was when you married me." "I knew who you pretended to be," Clara corrected softly. Before Julian could fire back, his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, and Clara watched his entire demeanor shift. The coldness vanished, replaced by a raw, immediate anxiety. It was the exact expression he had worn in her past life whenever Evelyn called. Evelyn Vance, his childhood sweetheart. The woman who had left for Paris 4 years ago, only to return the exact week Julian and Clara married. In her first life, Clara believed Evelyn was just a frail, tragic friend suffering from chronic leukemia. She had spent years cooking special meals for Evelyn, driving her to appointments, and stepping into the shadows so Julian could comfort her. She hadn't realized until the very end that she was nothing but a walking blood bank and an organic spare part, kept healthy until Evelyn's body was ready for the ultimate harvest. "I have to take this," Julian said, already turning back towards the door. "Evelyn's oxygen levels dropped. She's at the clinic. Don't wait up." "Julian!" Clara called out. He stopped, his hand on the brass doorknob, looking back with an impatient sigh. "Clara, I don't have time for your jealousy. A human life is at stake. If you walk out of that door tonight, Don't come back, she said. Her voice didn't tremble. Her hands were perfectly steady, clasped loosely in front of her. Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh. You've been threatening to leave for 3 years, Clara. We both know you have nowhere to go. Your family sold you to my father for a corporate bailout. You belong here. He pulled the door open, the cold wind whipping into the foyer. Stop acting like a child. I'll see you tomorrow. The door slammed shut. Clara stood in the silence of the massive, empty apartment. In her past life, she had fallen to her knees, sobbing until her throat was raw, waiting by the window until dawn. This time, she walked into the master bedroom, pulled a sleek black leather suitcase from the top of the closet, and began packing. She took only what she had brought into the marriage: a few old sweaters, her journals, and her grandmother's silver locket. She left the diamond necklaces, the designer gowns, and the platinum credit cards on the vanity. An hour later, Clara walked out of the penthouse. As she stepped into the rain, she didn't feel fear. She felt an intoxicating, blinding wave of freedom. The next morning, the financial district of Manhattan was buzzing. The Henderson Group, a multi-billion-dollar shipping conglomerate, was hosting its annual charity gala at the Plaza Hotel. It was an event Julian's family had tried to get invitations to for years, but the Hendersons were old money, fiercely exclusive, and completely out of reach for a rising tech mogul like Julian. Clara stood across the street from the plaza, wearing a simple, tailored black blazer and slacks she had bought with her own small savings account. She wasn't looking at the hotel. She was looking at the man stepping out of a sleek, armored Maybach. Arthur Henderson. He was a myth in the business world, ruthless, brilliant, and fiercely private. At 32, he commanded an empire that touched every major port in the world. But Clara didn't know him from the financial pages. She knew him from her dying days. In her past life, during her final week at St. Jude's, Arthur had been admitted to the VIP pavilion on the same floor. He had been poisoned by a close associate, a betrayal that had left him temporarily blinded and fighting for his life. In those dark, quiet nights when Julian was away with Evelyn, Clara had wandered into the rooftop garden, her body broken from the early stages of marrow extraction. There, she had found Arthur, struggling to navigate the terrace. They had spoken for hours in the dark, two betrayed souls sharing their quietest agonies. He never knew her name, and she only discovered his identity on the day she died, when she saw his recovery splashed across the news. Before she died, he had told her, "If I could see your face, I would spend the rest of my life ensuring no one ever made you feel small again." Clara watched him now. His eyes were sharp, a piercing, icy grey, completely healthy and scanning the crowd with commanding authority. 3 weeks later, the glass towers of Manhattan gleamed under a crisp autumn sun. Inside the executive boardroom of Henderson Global, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Julian sat at the mahogany conference table, his knuckles white against his leather briefcase. Beside him sat Thomas Vance, sweating profusely, nervously adjusting his silk tie. Julian was furious. Over the last 21 days, his life had quietly begun to unravel. Clara had vanished. She hadn't returned to the penthouse, she hadn't touched the bank accounts, and her family, who had tried to scream at her for ruining their corporate alliance, couldn't find a single trace of her. But Julian hadn't had time to look for her properly, because an anonymous whistleblower had triggered a massive federal audit of his tech firm's international shipping routes. Every single one of his European contracts had been frozen, and the trail led directly to Henderson Global's logistics network. Julian had spent weeks begging for a meeting with Arthur Henderson to clear his company's name. Today, he had finally been granted an audience. "Thomas, make sure the documentation is flawless," Julian muttered, his voice tight. "If Henderson cuts us off, we're bankrupt by the end of the quarter, and Evelyn's medical treatments depend entirely on our liquidity." I know," Thomas whispered, wiping his brow. "But Julian, how did Henderson find out about the Rotterdam discrepancies? Only you and I had those files." Before Julian could answer, the double doors of the boardroom swung open. 2 executive assistants stepped aside, and a tall, imposing figure walked in. Arthur Henderson looked every bit the corporate god he was. His dark suit perfectly tailored, his expression a mask of absolute indifference. But he didn't sit at the head of the table. Instead, he stepped to the side and held the door open for someone else. A woman walked into the room. She wore an ivory Chanel power suit that accentuated her long legs and elegant posture. Her dark hair fell in soft, glossy waves over her shoulders, and her lips were painted a bold, striking crimson. Her eyes were bright, cold, and utterly commanding. Julian's breath caught in his throat. He half stood from his chair scraping violently against the floor. "Clara?" Clara didn't look at him with the warmth, fear, or desperate longing he had grown accustomed to over 3 years. She looked at him the way a scientist looks at a specimen under a microscope. She walked to the head of the table, smoothly pulling out the leather chair, and sat down. Arthur immediately sat to her right, his eyes fixed on her with an unvarnished, protective devotion that made Julian's stomach twist in a sudden, inexplicable knot of jealousy. "What is the meaning of this?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Clara, stop this ridiculous games. Why are you wearing that? Get your things and go to the car. We are in the middle of an international business negotiation." Clara leaned back, crossing her legs elegantly. She tapped a sleek silver pen against the mahogany table. "Mr. Cross, you seem mistaken. You are not in a position to give orders. You are here to beg for your company's life. And as the Chief Strategy Officer of Henderson Global, I am the one who decides whether to pull the plug." "Chief Strategy Officer?" Thomas Vance gasped, his face turning entirely pale. "Julian, what is she talking about?" "Clara, enough!" Julian slammed his hand on the table, his temper flaring. "I don't know how you tricked Mr. Henderson into this stunt, but you are my wife. Your place is at home, not playing dress-up in a boardroom." "Mr. Henderson, I apologize for my wife's behavior. She's been experiencing some emotional instability lately." Arthur's eyes turned to ice. The air in the room plummeted by 10 degrees. He leaned forward, his massive frame radiating an oppressive, lethal aura. "Mr. Cross, if you raise your voice to my executive director again, I will have my security team throw you out of this window. And as for her being your wife..." Arthur reached into his breast pocket and slid a document across the table. "I believe you'll find those are fully executed divorce papers, signed by Clara and countersigned by the New York Supreme Court as of 9 o'clock this morning. Your marriage is legally dead, just like your company." Julian stared at the papers. His signature wasn't on them, because under New York law, Clara's attorneys had successfully filed an emergency petition for asset forfeiture and separation based on documented corporate fraud committed by her spouse's firm. You divorced me?" Julian whispered, looking at Clara as if seeing her for the first time. The quiet, submissive woman who used to wait up until 3 a.m. with a warm plate of food was gone. In her place sat a goddess who held his entire destiny in her manicured hands. "Why? Because I missed an anniversary?" Clara, we've been together for years. How can you be so heartless?" "Heartless?" Clara let out a soft, melodic laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Julian, let's talk about heartless. Let's talk about how Thomas Vance used your logistics shell companies to smuggle restricted biochemical components into Western Europe, the very components that Henderson Global flagged 3 weeks ago." Thomas jumped up. "That's a lie. You have no proof." Clara smiled. She pressed a button on the remote in her hand. The massive LED screen on the wall lit up, displaying bank routing numbers, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and a series of recorded phone calls. Thomas's voice filled the room, clearly discussing the illegal shipments and detailing how they would use Julian's tech firm as the scapegoat if the authorities ever caught on. Julian turned to Thomas, his eyes wide with horror. "Thomas, you told me those shipments were just medical supplies for Evelyn." "They were," Clara interrupted smoothly, her voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. "But they were also a highly lucrative side business. And here is the first plot twist of the day, Julian. You thought you were saving Evelyn by funding her experimental treatments through this partnership. But did you ever bother to look at her medical charts? Arthur, show them." Arthur signaled his assistant, who handed Julian a thick manila folder. Julian opened it, his hands shaking violently. As he read the documents, his face drained of all color. The medical records, certified by the International Medical Board, showed that Evelyn Vance's leukemia had been in complete remission for over 18 months. She wasn't dying. She didn't need a bone marrow transplant. The entire illness had been elaborately faked, orchestrated by Evelyn and Thomas to extract millions of dollars from Julian's tech firm and to manipulate him into keeping Clara isolated as a potential donor, ensuring Clara's family assets remained tied up in Julian's control. "Not at all." The heavy oak doors of the boardroom clicked shut, sealing Julian and his shattered empire inside. Clara walked down the hushed, carpeted hallway of Henderson Global, her pulse thrumming a steady, victorious rhythm against her wrists. She didn't look back. There was no hesitation in her stride, no lingering doubt holding her captive to the ghost of her past life. But as they stepped into the private sanctuary of Arthur's executive suite, the adrenaline finally crashed. Clara's shoulders dropped, and a sudden involuntary tremor shook her hands. It wasn't fear. It was the overwhelming, intoxicating shock of survival. In her previous life, she had died a discarded, broken thing. Today, she had just executed the man who killed her. Arthur didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer empty, patronizing platitudes. Instead, he walked to his mahogany wet bar, poured 2 fingers of neat bourbon into a crystal glass, and gently pressed it into her trembling hands. His large, warm hands enveloped hers, steadying the glass. "Drink," Arthur murmured, his voice a low, grounding rumble. Clara took a slow sip. The liquid fire burned down her throat, anchoring her to the present. She looked up into Arthur's striking grey eyes. They weren't cold anymore. They were soft, filled with an unguarded, fierce adoration that made her breath catch. "I used to beg him," Clara whispered, the residual ache of her past life bleeding into her voice. "For years, I cooked his meals, ironed his shirts, and sat by the window like a dog waiting for its master. I let him convince me I was nothing." Arthur stepped closer, invading her space in the most comforting way imaginable. He reached up, his thumb gently brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. "The man who starves a soul of light does not deserve the sun when it finally rises. You will never beg again, Clara. I will spend the rest of my days ensuring your crown never slips and that the world remembers exactly who you are." He leaned down and kissed her, not with the urgent, selfish taking she had endured in her marriage, but with a slow, reverent worship. It was a promise sealed against her lips, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, Clara felt entirely safe. Later that evening, the storm finally broke over Manhattan. Clara sat on the plush velvet sofa in Arthur's penthouse, the city lights glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Arthur handed her a sleek silver tablet, his expression immensely satisfied. "My intelligence team just finalized the asset sweep," Arthur said, taking a seat beside her. "Julian's collapse was faster than even I anticipated." Clara scrolled through the financial briefs. The precision of Arthur's corporate warfare was beautiful. Henderson. Global Intelligence Asset Liquidation Summary. Corporate Asset. Current Legal Status. Primary Consequence. Main Tech Holdings. Federal Seizure. Total Corporate Bankruptcy. Offshore Shell Accounts. Frozen by Interpol. Thomas faces 15 years. Manhattan penthouse, foreclosed. Immediate eviction pending. "He loved his ledgers more than anything," Clara murmured, a cool smile playing on her lips. "Now, he is just a negative balance." Before Arthur could reply, Clara's encrypted cell phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. The caller ID made her blood run cold. It was St. Jude's Medical Center, the exact hospital where she had died in her past life. She answered it. "This is Clara." "Clara, this is Dr. Harris." The voice on the other end was tight with urgency. "I know your marriage was legally dissolved today, but Julian listed you as the unalterable emergency medical proxy on his private accounts years ago. You need to come down here. It's Evelyn." 30 minutes later, Clara and Arthur walked through the sliding glass doors of St. Jude's. The smell hit Clara instantly, the sharp chemical scent of antiseptic, bleach, and stale air. A phantom pain flared deep in her hips, the ghost of the extraction needles drilling into her marrow. Her breathing hitched, but Arthur's arm instantly wrapped around her waist, a solid, unyielding shield of warmth. "I am right here," he whispered. They walked into the intensive care unit waiting room. The sight that greeted them was pathetic. Julian, the once impeccable CEO, was curled on a plastic chair, looking like a deranged vagrant. His bespoke charcoal suit was wrinkled and stained, his tie missing, his hair wild. When he saw Clara, his bloodshot eyes widened. He practically fell to the floor, scrambling toward her. "Clara! Clara, thank God you're here!" Julian reached out, trying to grab her legs. 2 of Arthur's private security contractors immediately stepped forward, grabbing Julian by the shoulders and throwing him roughly back against the sterile wall. Arthur stepped in front of Clara, his eyes lethal. "Keep your hands off my fiancé," Arthur growled, the word echoing through the quiet hallway like a gunshot. Julian stared at Arthur, then at Clara, his face crumbling. "Fiancé? Clara, please, I don't care about the company anymore. I went to Evelyn's apartment to confront her. She was packing her bags to leave me. But then she collapsed. She started coughing up blood. I thought she was faking it again. I swore to God I thought it was another act." Dr. Harris emerged from the double doors, holding a thick medical chart. He looked at Clara, his expression grim. "The irony is cruel, Clara. We ran Evelyn's blood work. Her previous records were indeed falsified by a private clinic in Paris, but to simulate the physical symptoms of leukemia, the bruising, the weakness, the weight loss, Evelyn took massive doses of black market immunosuppressants over the course of 3 years. The doctor sighed heavily. The drugs completely decimated her immune system. It triggered a catastrophic failure of her biological systems. She isn't faking it anymore. Evelyn has developed acute, end-stage aplastic anemia. Her bone marrow has completely stopped producing blood cells. Clara stood frozen. The universe had delivered its karmic justice with a brutal, flawless poetry. The woman who had faked a terminal illness to steal Clara's life was now actually dying of the exact same condition. She needs a bone marrow transplant within 48 hours, or her organs will shut down, Dr. Harris said softly. And Clara, we checked the National Registry. Just like 3 years ago, you are still the only perfect biological match in the country. Julian fell to his knees, openly weeping, his forehead pressing against the cold linoleum floor. Please, Clara, I know I am a monster. I know I destroyed us. But she will die. They are putting her on a ventilator tonight. Just give her the marrow. It's a simple procedure for you. You're her only hope. The fluorescent lights of the corridor hummed, casting a brutal, unyielding glare over the scene. Julian remained on his knees, his hands clasped as if praying to a deity he had spent a lifetime insulting. His tears wet the sterile linoleum, but Clara felt absolutely nothing. The frantic, weeping man before her was a stranger wearing the face of her former executioner. "Clara, please," Julian choked out, his voice cracked and hollowed by despair. "I know I don't deserve your mercy. I know I was blind. But she's dying. If you walk away now, you're sentencing her to death. How can you live with that?" Clara looked past him, staring through the small glass window of the intensive care unit. Inside, hooked to a maze of clear plastic tubes and a heavy mechanical ventilator, lay Evelyn. The woman who had once been the picture of delicate, fragile beauty looked skeletal. Her skin was a translucent, sickly grey, and dark purple hematomas blotched her arms where her failing vessels leaked into her flesh. She was suffering the exact fate she had faked for years to manipulate everyone around her. Clara took a slow, deep breath, feeling the full expansion of her healthy lungs. She remembered her past life, the agonizing ache in her hips, the cold sweat of systemic failure, and the way Julian had looked right past her suffering to comfort the woman in this very bed. "How can I live with it, Julian?" Clara asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through his frantic breathing like a razor blade. "I will live with it beautifully." Julian froze, his head snapping up, his eyes wide with horror. "What?" "I am not a spare part," Clara said, her voice steady, cold, and entirely devoid of malice. It was the calm of absolute certainty. "For 3 years you treated me like an inconvenience, an obstacle to your true happiness. You told me my worth was tied entirely to what I could provide for you and Evelyn. You forced me into a corner, stripped me of my dignity, and threw me out when you thought you had taken everything. I was wrong!" Julian screamed, trying to reach for the hem of her trousers again, only to be blocked instantly by the iron wall of Arthur's security detail. "I swear I didn't know they were using me. I thought I was protecting her. Clara, she's a human being." "And so was I," Clara replied sharply, her eyes flashing with a sudden, brilliant fire. "But you didn't care about my humanity when you demanded I sign our lives away. You didn't care when you left me to drown in my own grief while you ran to her side. The registry is voluntary, Julian, and as of this moment, I am officially withdrawing my name as an eligible donor for Evelyn Vance." Dr. Harris nodded quietly in the background, a somber but understanding look on his face. He made a swift notation on his tablet and stepped back into the room to manage the failing patient. Julian let out a raw, animalistic howl of grief, pulling at his hair as the finality of his ruin settled into his bones. His company was gone. His reputation was ashes. His freedom was a matter of hours. And now, the woman he had sacrificed everything to protect was slipping into the abyss because he had spent years breaking the only person who could have saved her. Arthur stepped into the light, his massive frame towering over the broken man on the floor. He didn't look down at Julian with anger. He looked down with the absolute contempt of a predator that had already won. He reached out, wrapping his large, warm hand around Clara's fingers, intertwining them perfectly. "Your time is up, Mr. Cross," Arthur said, his deep voice carrying the weight of an executioner's gavel. "My legal team has already turned over the complete unedited Rotterdam manifests and Thomas's offshore ledgers to the United States Attorney's Office. Look behind you." Julian turned his head slowly, his tear-streaked face mirroring a ghost. Walking down the long hospital corridor were 3 federal agents in dark suits, their golden badges glinting under the lights. They moved with a clinical, unhurried purpose, heading straight for Julian. "Julian Cross," the lead agent announced, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit corporate fraud, smuggling of restricted materials, and international money laundering. Stand up and place your hands behind your back." Julian didn't fight. He didn't have the strength left to stand. The agents pulled him roughly to his feet, clicking the heavy metal cuffs around his wrists. As they began to lead him away, he twisted his head back, his eyes searching frantically for Clara one last time. "Clara," he sobbed, his voice echoing off the walls of the intensive care unit. "Clara, I love you. I've always loved you. Please don't leave me in the dark." Clara stood tall, her hand resting securely in Arthur's grip. She didn't blink as Julian was dragged away, his desperate cries fading down the hall until the heavy fire doors swung shut, cutting off his voice forever. The silence that followed was pristine. The air in the hospital no longer felt heavy or suffocating. The phantoms of her past life had finally been laid to rest. Arthur turned her toward him, his hands cupping her face with an exquisite, tender reverence. He looked down into her eyes, his grey gaze fierce and protective. "It's over, my love. You are completely free." "I am," Clara whispered, a genuine, radiant smile breaking across her face, melting the last remnants of winter from her soul. "Let's go home, Arthur." 6 months later, the spring breeze swept through the manicured gardens of the Henderson estate in Long Island. The dark, rain-slicked streets of Manhattan felt like a lifetime away. Clara stood on the stone terrace, wearing a breathtaking gown of silk and lace that caught the golden afternoon sun. Her skin was glowing, her body strong, her heart full. From behind her, 2 strong arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against a broad, solid chest. Arthur buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the sweet scent of her perfume. "The guests are waiting, future Mrs. Henderson," Arthur murmured against her skin, his voice thick with a deep, unshakable contentment. Clara turned around in his arms, looping her hands behind his neck. She looked out at the lawn, where hundreds of the world's most powerful figures had gathered to celebrate their wedding, not out of obligation, but out of profound respect for the empire she and Arthur had built together over the last half-year. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant gold, Clara leaned into Arthur's embrace, her heart finally at peace. She was no longer a discarded shadow, but a queen who had claimed her throne. If Clara's triumphant journey of rebirth, revenge, and true love resonated with you, please hit the like button. Share this video with anyone who deserves a second chance at life, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another powerful story.